The sky did not darken, it vanished. A massive wave struck the boat with the force of a falling mountain, sending a deluge of seawater across the deck. Peter lunged for the hemp ropes, his fingers locking onto the wet fibers until his knuckles turned white. He braced his legs against the shifting planks, straining to hold the sail in place as the wind fought to tear it from the mast. Nearby, John scrambled across the slick wood, scooping water frantically with a wooden bucket, his eyes darting toward the stern. The vessel groaned, kilting at a sharp, sickening angle as more water surged over the gunwales. The roar of the gale was absolute, a howling void that swallowed every shout. Yet, in the middle of the chaos, amidst the snapping canvas and the violent lurching of the hull, Jesus lay undisturbed on a cushion. His breathing was slow and steady. Peter braced against a beam, the freezing spray blinding him, and stared at the figure in the back. The wind shrieked, the timber cracked, and the sea continued to rise. But the man on the cushion did not stir. The memory of the shore was still vivid, a sharp contrast to the biting spray now stinging their faces. Only hours earlier, the water of Galilee had been a calm, copper-colored mirror under the late afternoon sun. The air was warm, smelling of salt and dry earth. They had pushed off with purpose, the rhythm of the oars providing a steady, reliable cadence that echoed across the surface. Peter had gripped the wood with practiced ease, his movements fluid and efficient. These were waters they knew by heart. They were masters of their craft, seasoned by years of labor under the same vast sky. As they moved further from the land, the light had deepened into a rich, golden amber, casting long shadows across the deck. There was no fear then, only the simple expectation of a routine crossing. John had laughed at some passing remark, the sound carrying clearly over the gentle lap of water against the hull. It was a time of quiet confidence. They had watched the shoreline recede, certain of their strength, unaware that the atmosphere was already beginning to thicken. The horizon was still open, the light was still holding, and the sea had not yet turned against them. The shift happened as the sun dipped behind the western hills. The warmth that had bathed the deck vanished, replaced by a sudden, biting chill that seeped into the marrow. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and impending pressure. Above the distant peaks, a jagged, ink-black cloud tore through the sky, expanding rapidly and swallowing the last remnants of the amber light. The horizon, once clear and inviting, blurred into a singular, suffocating shade of slate. Below them, the water reacted. The rhythmic, gentle lap against the hull stuttered, then stopped. The surface, previously a calm mirror, began to ripple with a nervous, unpredictable energy. A gust of wind whipped across the lake, catching the sail with a violent snap that rattled the mast. The smooth, copper-colored water darkened into a churning, gray abyss, its depths hidden beneath a chaotic froth. The men stopped their work, oars hovering above the surface, as they scanned the sky. The familiar geography of the lake had dissolved. The wind shifted again, sharper this time, pushing the boat deeper into the gloom. The transition from serenity to menace was complete, leaving the vessel exposed on a restless, darkening expanse. The first swell slammed into the hull with the force of a battering ram. Wood groaned, a deep, structural protest that vibrated through the deck. Seawater surged over the gunwales, cold and relentless, turning the floor into a slick, treacherous hazard. Peter braced his legs wide, hands locked onto the rigging, but the wind shredded his voice before it left his throat. He shouted for a heading, for a shift in the sail, but his commands were lost in the roar of the gale. Rain arrived in a horizontal sheet, lashing against the men and blinding them to the world beyond the mast. John scrambled toward the center of the deck, his movements frantic as he grabbed a wooden scoop. He began to bail, but the volume of water flooding the boat far outpaced his efforts. The rhythm of the work was gone. replaced by a jagged, desperate scramble. The men were no longer looking at the horizon. They were looking at the rising water and the shifting angle of the deck. Their professional focus, forged in years of labor, dissolved under the weight of the sea. Every man moved in isolation, driven by the instinct to stay upright as the vessel pitched violently into the dock. The boat was no longer a tool of their trade, but a cage of splintering wood and chaotic sound. The boat pitched to port, the angle so sharp that the gunwale dipped beneath the churning froth. Water poured over the side in a continuous, heavy stream, rushing toward the center of the deck. One of the men lost his footing as the wood beneath him slicked with brine. He slid, his fingers clawing at the wet planks, legs dangling over the dark, hungry gap where the railing had vanished. Another man lunged, fingers hooking into the sleeve of his companion, dragging him back onto the slanting deck just as a fresh wave smashed against the hull. The impact knocked the wind from them both. They huddled against the mast, paralyzed by the realization that their strength was nothing against this force. The boat groaned, a high-pitched, structural scream of timber under impossible stress. Every movement of the vessel felt final, as if the next dip would be the one to pull them under. They looked at the dark water swirling around their boots, then at the empty, grey horizon. The last remnants of their composure vanished. They were no longer trying to sail, they were simply trying to hold on as the world tilted toward the abyss. The deck felt less like a floor and more like a sliding trap, pushing them closer to the dark, freezing depths with every passing second. The deck lurched again, throwing two men against the mast with a sickening thud. They looked toward the stern, where the motion of the water seemed less violent, yet the danger remained absolute. Amidst the spray, the canvas snapping like gunfire, and the roar of the wind, they saw him. He lay on a cushion, head resting against the wood, entirely still. The sight triggered a surge of raw, uncontained terror. How could he remain asleep while the sea tore their world apart? Peter crawled over the wet, shifting surface, his hands slipping on the brine-slicked wood. He reached the stern, followed by John, both men gasping for air. They did not hesitate. They grabbed his shoulders and shook him hard, their fingers digging into his frame. The boat tilted again, nearly throwing them onto the floorboards, but they held their grip. Their voices broke, strained and ragged, as they shouted into his ear, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" The plea was a frantic, high-pitched demand for recognition. They were past the point of duty. They were at the limit of their endurance. They stared at him, waiting for his eyes to open. Their bodies braced against the next inevitable wave that threatened to drag them all into the deep. The pressure of their hands against his frame finally broke the silence of his rest. Jesus opened his eyes. He did not blink against the spray, or flinch at the deafening roar of the gale. He looked at the men, his gaze sharp and clear, cutting through the panic that had turned their faces pale. He sat up and pushed himself to his feet. The boat bucked, rising on a massive swell and dropping into a trough with a bone-jarring impact. Yet he did not sway. He stood as if rooted to the floorboards, his balance absolute, unaffected by the wild instability of the craft. The disciples scrambled back, their hands still slick with seawater, watching him move toward the stern. He reached the edge where the wind was strongest and the water hung like a wall. He did not shout to be heard over the storm. He did not struggle against the gale. He simply turned his face toward the raging horizon and the churning black abyss. His presence filled the space, drawing the focus of the wind and the waves. He raised a hand, his posture commanding the very air to shift. He spoke, and his voice carried a weight that silenced the thunder. "Peace, be still." The response was immediate and absolute. The wind, which had moments ago been screaming through the rigging, vanished in a single heartbeat. The air turned heavy and still, as if the atmosphere itself had been pinned in place. Beyond the gunwales, the waves that had been towering Jagged walls of gray water collapsed. They did not settle slowly. They smoothed instantly into glassy, rhythmic ripples. The rain stopped as if a heavy curtain had been drawn across the sky, leaving the air dry and cold. Above, the thick clouds tore apart, revealing a sharp, silver moon that cast a sudden, pale light over the deck. The silence was heavy, ringing in the ears of the men who had been shouting just seconds before. They stood motionless, their hands still gripping the ropes, their knuckles slowly relaxing as the tension left their muscles. The boat sat flat and steady on the water, no longer fighting against the deep. Peter looked from the horizon, which was now a clear, dark line, to the water, which looked like polished glass. He turned his head, his breath hitching in his chest, and looked at the man who stood near the bow. No one spoke. The shift was too total, too profound for words to bridge the gap between their terror and this sudden, impossible peace. Jesus turned away from the water. He faced the men, his eyes calm, his stance relaxed, as if he had just finished a morning walk. The silence on the boat was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic lapping of the now gentle lake against the wood. Peter gripped the hemp rope and slowly let it drop. It pulled on the deck with a soft thud. Jesus looked at each of them, his gaze lingering on the hands that had been frantically bailing water only moments ago. "Why are you afraid?" he asked. "Have you still no faith?" The words hung in the still air, heavier than the storm had ever been. The men did not answer. They could not. They looked at each other, then back at the man standing before them. The terror of the drowning had been replaced by a sharper, colder realization of who was standing in the boat. They shifted their weight, stepping back instinctively, unable to reconcile the man they had known with the power they had just witnessed. One by one, they began to whisper, their voices barely audible above the gentle movement of the boat. "Who then is this?" they murmured, their eyes wide and searching. "That even the wind and the sea obey him?" They stood, frozen, bound by a new, profound awe that made the very air feel thin and sharp. The boat drifted slowly, no longer a vessel of survival, but a space of deep, quiet understanding. The men looked at the dark water, then at each other, their faces illuminated by the silver moonlight. They understood now that the storm had not been the end, but a lens through which they saw something far beyond their grasp. Faith was not a simple lack of danger, nor was it the pretense that the rising waves were small. It was the hard, cold recognition that fear did not possess the final authority over their lives. They watched the horizon, where the jagged clouds had vanished into the night. The water moved with a gentle, rhythmic pulse against the hull, a reminder of the power that had just silenced the gale. They stood together on the deck, exhausted, yet anchored by a truth that remained even when the stars were obscured. The one who had commanded the sea to be still was not merely a guest in their boat. He was the master of the very elements that had threatened to consume them. As the boat glided toward the distant shore, they stopped looking for the threat. They looked at the man who remained, and in the silence, they found the core of their journey. Fear had lost its grip. The storm had passed, but the presence remained.